Bonjour à toutes et à tous. Dans cette interview, j'ai eu l'immense plaisir d'interviewer Stefan Kistler, mon ancien directeur à Chaikuni, qui a travaillé plus de 10 ans dans cette magnifique organisation et qui travaille dorénavant en Suisse avec l'organisation, l'ONG Rainforest Norway, aussi dans la défense de la forêt amazonienne. Du coup, dans cette interview, on parle de son parcours, on parle de la création de l'Institut Chaikuni et de ses différents programmes, et également tous les challenges qu'affronte l'Amazonie, euh, cet écosystème qui nous fait tous vivre au final, et, et les solutions que de magnifiques organisations comme Chaikuni, comme Rainforest Norway proposent des solutions pour la reforestation, pour la protection de la forêt et des peuples indigènes. Donc du coup, si ces sujets vous parlent et que vous pouvez apporter votre contribution ou en savoir plus, je mets les liens de ces deux sites web dans la description et vous pourrez aller visiter et contribuer si vous pouvez, si vous souhaitez. Voilà. Et également, c'est vos encouragements qui permettent que je continue ce travail, que ce soit la traduction, aller à la rencontre de ces voix inspirantes et les rendre accessibles à toutes et à tous. Donc n'hésitez pas, si ce projet vous parle, vous inspire, à mettre un petit commentaire, à partager et à soutenir si vous avez les moyens. Voilà, ça m'aide énormément pour continuer cette aventure d'interviewer des belles personnes comme Stéphane. Stéphane, il a cette capacité de parler en profondeur de sujets qui sont assez complexes comme la sauvegarde de l'Amazonie. Voilà, je pense que vous allez pouvoir apprécier sa longue expérience et, et sa vision. Bonne interview à tous. Thank you, Stefan, for your time, for coming here for this little interview. I came to know you and Chaikuni. Well, we just remember like 4 years ago. I first contacted you to come for volunteers in Chaikuni, and yeah, you have been at the time you was the director of Chaikuni. You have been directing Chaikuni for more than a decade since the beginning, and now you are also working with a new organization in Switzerland, Rainforest Norway. And, well, for the people that don't know you, could you present yourself? Who are you, and what have been your path, personal path, and also professional career?
Okay, yeah. Well, first a little small correction because I wasn't directing Chaikuni all those 10 years, but I came down to Iquitos in 2012, and the motivation was to just to be in the Amazon, be there where be close to the communities and be close to where things happen while I was working, And so I started in the Rainforest Foundation Norway. Started working with indigenous peoples and the rainforest protection, but in Central Africa, in Congo. And after 3 years doing that, I felt I needed to go to the Amazon because I think the Amazon was always the inspiration to go this path. And I think I visited the Amazon for the first time in 2000. It must be 2006 or 2007. I was lucky enough to do some research in Bolivia and the Bolivian Amazon. So this kind of fascination didn't let me go, So I decided to come down here, and I was connected to something that is that was the predecessor of Chaikuni, which was called Alianza Cana, and the same founder, Matthew, is behind it. And I contacted him, and he said, yes, just come down and work with us. So I did. And at that moment, Alianza Cana was working more on environmental justice, indigenous people's rights. And then the story goes that at some moment Alianza Cana and Chaikuni Institute were fused. That's when we got these three programs that we have today: cultural education, human rights, the rights of nature, and also permaculture, which we now have, which Chaikuni now has a focus on agroforestry. So that's a bit of the long story in a short nutshell. And there has been a lot of people along the way shaping Chaikuni. Obviously, Matthew founded it and was founded as a permaculture center, which tried to change turn the area where both the temple and the Chaikuni Institute are, turn it into sort of like a permaculture haven for an self-sufficient. It was even at that time like projected as being a place, kind of like an eco-village where people would be living and sustainably of the land. And as you know, I think some of the most important developments were when we started to have this fusion with the other programs, and I think the focus shifted a bit from looking towards the inside or that piece of land towards being of service for the region. And I think that was a really important change, and I think at least for me that was then, it made a lot of sense and gave the big motivation to work on it and slowly build it and consolidate as well some of those approaches or some of those things Chaikuni kind of teaches now or tries to work within the community. And it's been a long path, and I think there's so much to learn. And in the beginning, we were speaking perhaps about agroforestry and chakras and so forth, but I think we needed all those years to kind of define what it is what we really wanted, and we needed to have people like you. And the main thing I think is getting this experience of working with indigenous people and learning from them, because that's the main approach. I think at Chaikuni is learning from the indigenous peoples who have lived here for millennia and have practiced a sort of like a way of life in harmony with the forest. I mean, they've been conserving it, protecting it all those millenniums, and they are still the best stewards of their territories. Yeah. Was that interesting?
Well, I know you have been working in the Amazon in Chaikuni, and now also continuing with Rainforest Norway for more than a decade. So I think it will be really interesting if you could share in your perspective what are the main challenges that are facing the Amazon and also the Amazon, and also of course indigenous people that live there.
Yeah, I think the main challenge, has been around for centuries even. I think the main challenge is that society, everything outside of the Amazon has always looked at the Amazon as sort of like a reservoir of resources to just exploit, take out. And somehow there was maybe this belief that it will never end. You can just take out and take out and take out. It's just like a grocery store or it's an area to exploit, and kind of that has continued like from the start. I think when European explorers came here, and it was just looked at it as this place to make money off, and often with this as well, kind of ignored that people call this their home, and it continues. It went in waves from from the rubber boom in the early 1900s, animal furs, then timber, then around the 60s or 70s came the oil boom, and it just continues, and there's this big need to change that, what you call that, to change that paradigm, or change that way of looking at the Amazon, and starting to understand that the Amazon as an ecosystem is fundamental as well to the whole world and to our climate. I think that knowledge is kind of slowly but surely getting some more attention. I think people are realizing that, but we have already come quite far with deforesting much of this ecosystem. And for the people who've been living here, I mean, obviously, people from outside just looking at their territories as something to exploit and kind of rape in a way, obviously creates a lot of challenges, because indigenous peoples always they needed large territories, and the modern states they don't want to give those territories to the people that lived there for a long time. They usually give just small pieces of land, and then other areas where these people have traditionally roamed and used resources from, they are often like licensed away to both mining, oil, logging concessions. So that's a major challenge. And then I think an important one, which is maybe not as much known, but I think both Chaikuni and also the place I'm working in right now have known, or have tried to show for a long time, is that indigenous peoples have traditionally had extreme specialized knowledge on how to live with the forest, of the forest, and not do any harm to it. And society has always told them that their knowledge is worthless. And I think part of Chaikuni's mission and the Rainforest Foundation mission and other like-minded NGOs is to revalorize this kind of knowledge, and in a way acknowledge that this is also science. This knowledge is also science. And since the indigenous people themselves were being told by the state that your knowledge is kind of worthless, you should adapt to mainstream society, to the dominating society, you need to learn to speak Spanish, you need to send your kids to school, they need to go study and go to the cities. And this has been going on for many, many decades, and I think many indigenous peoples, at least the ones that are a bit closer to cities and populated centers, have started to believe this themselves. So that's why much of this knowledge wasn't passed on anymore to the next generation. I think that's the situation we are in right now, and I think Chaikuni is also making an effort there to work with indigenous students, which are in a sort of like a privileged position to be able to go to study, sort of supporting them to navigate both worlds and be sort of proud and aware and proud of their cultural heritage, and sort of looking for a way to to be both, or to connect both and take the best out of both. And I think take the best out of both is a bit of a good lemma, because in a way what Chaikuni is advocating with agroforestry, I think starts with indigenous knowledge, starts with all this incredible cultural heritage here, but then obviously there's also sort of more like recent study fields like agroecology, permaculture, which is a bit of everything, and fusing traditional and sort of more modern, if you can term it like that, is very powerful. And so I think that proposal from Chaikuni is very powerful in itself, and I think it's the way to go. You know, it's the way to go, and it holds a super key spot, I think, in this current global quest to sort of stop climate change in a way, which means we need to stop destroying the forest and find ways to leave the forest standing and still live well, you know, still being able to provide well-being for the forest communities. So yeah.
You were sharing about the intercultural education program of Chaikuni. Do you have some example of students that have having let's say successful not career but studies,
Mm-hmm.
and then come back to their communities and
Yeah, for sure. I mean, I think this is some of the most satisfying or giving aspects of the work Chaikuni is doing, or I was involved in doing, is remembering these students who really sort of found their way. And obviously I could probably mention a handful of names of impressively resilient young students who come from their communities and sort of like battle a lot of adversities and sort of against all odds manage to get a degree. And I do think, due to or thanks to sort of the involvement they had with Chaikuni's programs and workshops and activities, I think they were able to kind of navigate these two worlds in a better way. And of course, I think the main student, or the student that pops to my mind right away is Rodan, who, as Amat says, sort of against all odds somehow ended up at the university. And I think for the first year or two he was frustrated. He didn't really understand Spanish, you know, and he hadn't really touched a computer before. And so imagine what that means, like continuing, still, you know, going strong, making it through this, and a couple of years later he ends up, you know, with a degree, first anthropologist of the Matses people, and people were so fascinated by his thesis that he was invited to write a book. And I mean, the constellation is perfect in a way that he writes about a very important Matses ritual, which obviously had a great way of getting into it and describing it and exploring it and, you know, studying it for his thesis. So Roldan is an incredible example, incredibly gratifying. He was part of the organization of indigenous students that Chaikuni works with, and he was for 2 or 3 years part of the board. And he was one of the people I remember that would always be interested and come to the workshops and ask and look for advice of Chaikuni and, you know, learn from it with incredible learning curve. There's obviously other ones. There's there's a few girls or young women who also are like the first of of their people who managed to get a degree. And imagine difficulty for a girl to do that is just exponentially bigger even. And yeah, just lots of incredible individuals who we've been honored to work with.
Great.
So
I think also, well, especially in Chaikuni, even as a director, coordinating whole program, you was really working deeply in the rights programs, and a lot also with the petrol extraction. No? I know it's a story that is not much told, so I don't know if you could synthesize and share a bit about that.
Okay, yeah, sure. Basically, in the 60s and 70s, there was this oil exploration boom that arrived to the Amazon. I think it wasn't only in Peru. Definitely know it had the same thing happen in Ecuador. But so you imagine these foreign companies just getting into some areas in the middle of the rainforest with their machinery, helicopters, and what have you, to explore, like these machines to dig holes and explore whether there's any oil. And for the first 2 or 3 decades when this happening, there was just no control whatsoever from the state. It was off the map. It's so far away from Iquitos. It's, well, several days on a riverboat. And so this being off the map just also kind of let them do whatever they kind of wanted. And obviously indigenous communities had no idea what this was. They had no idea what oil was. So they were also obviously not, in a way, not going against this. It's strange as well. Actually, several communities kind of moved themselves to be closer to those, what they call the campamentos petroleros, the camps where the oil companies sort of had their machinery and started the exploration from. And yes, then Peru built a huge pipeline in the 70s from down here in the Amazon to the coast. And well, more than 50 years later, I think that pipeline hasn't been exchanged in any way. It hasn't been maintained well enough. So that pipeline is one of the major causes of oil spills all the time. And a bit more in the oil concessions, the communities that lived around these oil concessions, they have experienced dozens, if not hundreds, of oil spills that could have been anything from from an oil pipeline just behind their community to a fish, to a lake where they would traditionally go to fish, and the oil company just used it as a sort of like a dumping site for some of the crude or the oil that that they dumped. And so there's just these it's actually it's extremely, I don't know what word to use, it's scandalous, it's outrageous in a way what these oil companies were doing, and mostly haven't been punished until now. So decades later, this crude oil, this oil is still dumped somewhere, usually probably tapped over by the vegetation or intentionally by oil companies throwing over some earth from other sides. Like, there was definitely intentional covering up happening all the time, and communities are affected, were affected. The health-wise, there's not a lot of data. I think maybe towards the end of the 90s, you had the first studies, and perhaps organizations or even the state somehow got a little bit aware of this. It's just diseases that you couldn't explain where they come from, and people died. People properly, but it really affected their lives, and it keeps affecting their lives. And we're not just speaking about, he said we're speaking about death. I have no clue how many people died of that, but I wouldn't be surprised if it's a lot. And then obviously the relationship between communities and oil companies is quite complex. It's not in a way black and white, despite all these extremely negative impacts it has, both on the environment and on the communities and the people's health. It's not that black and white. It's not, if you'd maybe expect that no community would be in favor of these oil companies. They're hurting us, or they're killing us, so get out. But it's not like this, because these areas are so far away, and in the Peruvian Amazon in general, there's just an absence of the state or normal services that you and I take for granted both in Europe and maybe even here in the city. Health, education, enough food. So those communities turn to the oil companies because they kind of took over some of the role of the state. Then that's the only outside presence there, and the state wasn't there. So it created this really paradox or kind of perverted relationship or dependence between communities and the oil company. And we see that until today. But in reality, and this happens in a lot of places in the world, the sort of the richness or the money that was generated from taking out this oil from these areas, sort of like the wealth, the money to a very small portion actually got back to the communities, if at all. And you've been living now here in Loreto for the last 4 years yourself, and you can, even here in Quito, you can see, I don't like to speak of development, but if we speak in the normal terms of development, you see, is there a is there a good education system? Is there a good health system? Well, no. Is there a lot of poverty? Yes. If you look at Loreto, and even in the national context of Peru, Loreto always scores lowest in the Human Development Index. It always comes in the last few places, and so you have this huge region, Loreto, with these oil reservoirs, and they've been extracting oil for 50 years. And you look at this and okay, where did all this money or where did all this wealth go? It definitely didn't serve society as a whole. Seems like it probably served a few officials, government officials, clerks who somehow benefited into their own pockets. And it's this resource curse. It's a common thing, from countries that have a lot of resources, natural resources, but they don't. The society as a whole doesn't really benefit from it. Just only the few. And so this is a it's you asked me about this, and you made me kind of remind of it. And I was working with this, I think, when I came here, and I'm now a bit outdated, and that was intentional because I think I couldn't really handle it anymore. It's intense, and I wanted to kind of focus on something more positive, and I think that also was reflected a little bit in Chaikuni's work. There was, I think, an intention of trying to focus on solutions rather than focusing on problems. And within the indigenous movement, the term resistance is really important. resist from what's coming from what's imposed from the outside, resist against like this development frenzy that the state would, you know, leash upon you, and sort of like resist and stick with the cultural roots and resist. And I think that's super important. But I think on a personal level, it's more satisfying, or it started to make more sense to me that, you know, well, we need to denounce, we need to say what's wrong, but let's focus on what we can change, and let's focus on some of the solutions if there are any. And sort of like, you know, that gave it more of a positive twist to the work. And I think the development of the agroforestry program, which now is the biggest one of Chaikuni, and the work with the human rights and the rights of nature is a bit, you know, got a bit smaller. I think is reflected by this desire to offer solutions. I think that said, working on human rights and the rights of nature is a must in a way, and needs to be done. And I think this is why I've liked the proposal of Chaikuni working like with those three programs, because together they kind of offer a more holistic solution. Of course, there's lots of other things to work on as well, but I think education, rights, and sort of good living or permaculture in a way sort of offers a proposal there, right? And even though Chaikuni doesn't really have a program that is anything called with like health or medicine or anything, I think it's also implicit in a way that Chaikuni also has a focus on this, right? With the connection with the Temple of the Way of Light, with the connection that a lot of Chaikunis have kind of done personal work on this as well. And I've always loved when Tierra visited us, and with the three general fields of permaculture, he added the spiritual well-being to it.
Spiritual care.
The spiritual care, exactly. What is it? Fair share, like como es?
Fair share, people care,
Yeah.
and earth care,
and spiritual care. So I feel that Chaikuni has an important proposition or proposal to offer. Yeah, and it's really motivating, and you know, I hope can be consolidated, and I think that Chaikuni will have the possibility to work with more communities, and slowly but surely. I don't think it has to grow exponentially and suddenly be everywhere, because I think one of the key aspects of Chaikuni as well was to build like long-lasting relationships, both with families and communities and indigenous leaders, and build up something over time, because these things you don't just do them in a 2-year project or something. So building relationships and consolidating approaches and projects, I think is another key area of Chaikuni.
Wow, very interesting. And how, I don't know what I heard a lot, but I don't know, could you describe a little bit from the new organization, well, not new, it's a whole organization you work with now, Rainforest Norway?
Mm-hmm.
What's the vision, mission, a little bit of the organization?
Mm-hmm. Well, the Rainforest Foundations, or the Rainforest Foundation, has kind of a special story to it and how it was funded. It was funded by Sting, the artist, the music artist, who, together with Raoni, which is a chief of a Brazilian tribe. He is a very famous indigenous leader. They kind of toured some of the rainforests in Brazil in 1989, and it made Sting realize the urgency to protect indigenous peoples and the forests they live in. And so Sting urged kind of different countries to, you know, open rainforest foundation. There used to be more, but nowadays you have three main rainforest foundation, one in the UK, one in the US, and the biggest one is the Rainforest Foundation Norway. And nowadays it's more common to have this kind of approach, but I think when it was founded in 1989 and until today, the Rainforest Foundation has this approach to conserve large contiguous rainforests, but through strengthening indigenous peoples or human rights. So it's often a bit misunderstood as being a conservation organization, but it actually is just as much a human rights organization. So this mission of you know, guaranteeing basic rights of forest people that live in the forest, is behind kind of everything that the Rainforest Foundation does in order to conserve those large pieces of rainforests. That's important, and it's not always as clear. Usually starts with sort of a strong campaign or a struggle for indigenous peoples to get their rights to their territories acknowledged, you know, get tightly, is usually what it's called. Get sort of like a legal recognition from the state that yes, okay, this territory is yours. And there are different contexts across the Amazon. The Rainforest Foundation Norway right now is working in the Amazon in 3 countries: Brazil, Colombia, and Peru, the biggest Amazonian countries, or the countries with the largest part of the Amazon. And so these different countries have different contexts, right? To a different degree have they given the rights to the territories to the indigenous peoples. And this has been extremely interesting for me to see different contexts as well. And for example, Brazil has something called territories indígenas, you know, indigenous territory, indigenous reserves, which are protected by a state agency, and you can't just, go in there. More interestingly, and I've been learning this over the last few years, is the example of Colombia, which has a figure that is called indigenous municipalities. So a legal entity, a legal geographical entity of the state can be governed by an indigenous people. So I don't know which municipality you're from in France, no? But for example, I'm from Switzerland, I'm from the canton of Lucerne. Then there's smaller municipalities. And so it would be like a municipality would be entirely governed by an indigenous peoples. And I think that's what comes closest to this sort of like autonomous governance by indigenous people, having the right to their territory and deciding pretty much every aspect of their life and doing it according to their traditions and according to what they themselves decide. So Colombia has this incredible opportunity, or this incredible figure.
This is new, or this is?
There's a decree, which is a law. It came in 2018, and so it had some form of indigenous land tenure before, no? But this is more of a recent law, and so it's now about constituting those indigenous governments, and it's a difficult task, and some of the partners of the Rainforest Foundation already do that. It's accompanying indigenous peoples or indigenous communities, and guiding them or accompanying them to establish their government, and that means all spheres of life. They will decide on what kind of healthcare system they want on their territory, what kind of education, productive activities, and so forth. No? So that's a pretty incredible development in Colombia, quite progressive. And if we take it to Peru, I think Peru is lagging behind both of those countries. In Peru, there is something called indigenous reserves, but it's a different figure. It's for areas that actually has people that are living in isolation. They're not in contact. So indigenous organizations here in Peru have worked for over 20 years for this, to sort of establish reserves, indigenous reserves. But that's a different figure from what we were talking about, like indigenous governance. So in Peru, the only legal figure that is accepted is titling communities, and that just means a small part of the area that they traditionally inhabit and use. So it's usually where they have their houses and their chacras, but not the big areas that they used to for their livelihoods, and so for a long time RFN has supported indigenous partners that are pushing for something more integral. We often call it integral territories, territorio integral, which simply means that an indigenous people has the full territory that sort of traditionally belongs to an indigenous people. Let's say the Achuar. They have many different communities, and some of them are titled, but it's just isolated. And the Achuar have been fighting to get recognized the full territory. And in the case of the Achuar, or in any case, this would mean that then indigenous peoples have the right to decide as well what's happening on this territory. And Achuar territory, for example, is also a place where there's oil. And of course, the government doesn't want the Achuar to decide on that. And so there's been a lot of work on this, getting the recognition for indigenous territories, but it hasn't materialized yet. The Achuar and other people, like the Awahum, the One Piece, some of them also work together with Chaikuni, and some of them RFN is supporting. They are going the path of what they call indigenous autonomous governments, and it's sort of, they have done themselves a mapping exercise. Where are communities? Where is our traditional territory? Then they have organized politically, so like who's governing us, what kind of ministers or what kind of people do we need. They have then developed what they call planes de vida, life plans, like deciding on how we want to use our territory. And so based on that, this is kind of the vision of the indigenous movement here in Peru. They would like to get legal recognition for these territories and for the governments, as sort of like following the example of Colombia, where these governments then would have the decision power to decide what's happening in our territory in terms of education, in terms of resource exploitation, in terms of health.
So One Piece already did, or are in the process still?
The One Piece are sort of often mentioned as the pioneer example in Peru, because they went a sort of a path that the other governments didn't do, and instead of the fight or the struggle was always sort of like a legal battle, trying to get this figure recognized legally. See, it's like, okay, we need Peru to sketch a law, approve a law that says yes, indigenous people can have their integral territories. And the One Piece kind of decided, yes, that's important too, but we don't need Peru to tell us that we can have our own government, that we are autonomous. And they basically they argue within international legislation, which yes is way ahead, and which obviously grants the rights to indigenous people of self-determinance and government, self-governance. So they just went ahead, and I think they're probably the most organized indigenous peoples in Peru, and the government, the indigenous government that has come the furthest. But it's also right now this is a movement, and the IDSEP, which is the Peruvian umbrella organization for indigenous peoples in the Amazon, they are actively running a program that's called Indigenous Autonomous Governments, and sort of I think the tendency is definitely for indigenous peoples to go that way. Even the Shipibo, which a little bit, if you look at the temple, they also have sort of like a process going on of an autonomous government.
Amazing. And so Rainforest Norway are supporting all this initiative.
Rainforest Foundation, has been in Peru for I think since 2004, so for 20 years, and one of the regional indigenous organizations that has been leading sort of like the approach on how to define integral territories. Rainforest Foundation has been a company for like probably 15 years, and so they kind of opened the way for this. There's a methodology, indigenous nations, as they sometimes are called, they needed to define which is a territory. There's anthropological studies, resource management studies for the whole zone, and so forth, and a few documents. So they presented a whole folder or a whole expediente, as they call it, of this is us, this is the One Piece people, this is the Achuar people, this is the Shaw people, and this and this and this is why you need to give us the rights to our integral territories. This is something the Rainforest Foundation has been there from the very beginning, and I think, other donors as well are coming on board, and we do see a sort of an increase of funding, international donor funding to indigenous peoples, and hopefully or supposedly we can see that more and more people or states or organizations realize that sort of the best way to conserve the Amazon or conserve tropical forests is by guaranteeing the rights of the people who live there. Obviously, there's another figure of conservation areas, but indigenous territories have very low deforestation rates generally. So it's a very effective way of taking care of the Amazon.
Great. I think for wrapping up, what you will recommend if some people are interested to support this initiative? How can they do support?
Yeah, there's so many things you can actually do, and then obviously like making a donation is always the first thing that comes to your mind. I think if you consider making a financial contribution, I think it's good to seek out local organizations, smaller NGOs connected to territories, because they often have a bigger need. Bigger organization often have like more chance to get funding. But as a person, for example, living in France, you can do a lot of things yourself, and I mean it's all about your consumption. There's a lot of work being done to kind of show what kind of products contributes to deforestation, because it's very interconnected, right? For example, in Brazil, the main driver, or the driver of deforestation is what it's called. The main reason for deforestation is all these huge agricultural soy and cattle ranches. You just cut down hectares and hectares and hectares of rainforest, and then they send out the cattle or soy. So if you can avoid eating beef from Brazil or soy that's coming from Brazil, then that's a message that kind of sends a message, right? So it's like being conscious about what you consume is usually the first step, and the way you can kind of contribute to this cause. And obviously, sharing news, sharing what's happening, care, sharing the stories, for example, of those people that are affected by oil, because they almost never get hurt. So in these times of social media, if something like that can go viral or can be known by other people, then again it will probably affect, hopefully it will affect consumer behavior, and people will think twice before perhaps eating a steak from Brazil, but it's a difficult task in a way, and we often kind of underline a bit the urgency of it, because there's this, as you probably know, there's this scientists tell us that the entire ecosystem, the Amazon ecosystem, which is very much self-regulating, creating its own rain and so forth, and the system itself, as you know, working permaculture, like the importance of the system. And there's this theory that, scientists tell us that, this equilibrium, can also tip over into something else. And they speak of this tipping point, and if deforestation continues to a certain degree, then suddenly the Amazon will turn into something different, and turn into something that they imagine be more like savanna, dry forest, or no forest, and that would actually be catastrophic to the whole world, because it will interrupt the rain patterns and the climate patterns. And so it's urgent, because a lot of forest has been lost, and this tipping point is already being observed in some micro areas, in some regions, not on the pan-Amazon scale, but in some areas where deforestation has been extreme, you can already see that. And one of the manifestations of that is the increased forest fires. We have this forest fire season, and a tropical rainforest will not burn if it's healthy, if it's in a good state. It's wet, it's humid, cannot burn. But we see increasing forest fires, which is a sort of like a sign of this prophecy sort of coming, being on the way and so forth. So just that to say, sort of like to round up, that this is kind of an important and urgent matter, and I'm not sure it's a privilege, but I think it's it feels like we're doing something important, and hopefully a lot of other people can join this cause as well. Not all of them have to pack the bags and move to Quitos and work here, but it's important that this conscience is around and that people take it serious and do something about it.
Thank you so much, Stefan, for your time and for your commitment also to do this work, no? Even now in Switzerland with your family. And well, yeah, it has been a big honor for me also to join Chaikuni and to work for this beautiful organization.
Thank you.
Thank you, Camille.
A ti, muchas gracias.
Muy bueno.
¿Sí?
Sí.
Estamos bien.